today's conversation, we're utilizing the birth year of 1995 to 2010 as the age range for Generation Z. And even within this group, this age group, we're looking at almost two different subsets or two different populations. We've got what we call our little Zs, the youngest ones that were born between 2003 and 2010. And then our oldest, which would be our college students and maybe our high school or secondary students that were born 1995 to 2002. And we utilize 1995 as our marker year, if you will, of when this generation started, because that's when the internet became commercialized and widely available in homes pretty much, definitely in America and all over the world. And so it opens up a new world of access and information. And so Generation Z has never known a time without the internet. And we've seen rapid technological advancement since then. When we talk about understanding generations, there's some theoretical aspects we bring into this. Looking at generations, we recognize not every person in every generation will fit into that research. So we have outliers. We also recognize that there's a time between generations where young people are on the cusp, and so we call those cuspers, where they might have some blended characteristics of maybe millennials or older millennials looking a little bit more like Generation X. We see this with Generation Z, especially the older ones looking, potentially having some millennial characteristics. The younger ones might have some characteristics that they pass on to the next generation as well. We also recognize that when we look at generations, we're looking at groups of people. And so just like we would look at any other identity group, men, women, people from Brazil, people from America, even within the United States, we can't make assumptions and criticisms about a culture without really truly knowing them. And so that's what we're doing today, is really learning about their culture, their beliefs, perspectives, behaviors, and their outlook and how they've started to understand the world. Our research is coming from a few different places today. It's from the studies that we've conducted in 2014, as well as the study that was done here. Our research outside of today is also influenced by many other people. There's a lot of other universities and organizations that are talking about this group of young people. We work with the Higher Education Research Institute out of UCLA in California. We also have utilized studies from market research, youth research, and other industries that are trying to better understand the behaviors and values and perspectives of Generation Z. But today's research is going to be coming, the data is coming from the US perspective, from our research that we did in 2014 and the Brazilian research that was done this year with our team here.
Great. So before we get into understanding Generation Z, we have to better understand what influences generations to be who they are. We have just finished a book called Generation Z, A Century in the Making, and the book is really about how the last 100 years have shaped this generation. It doesn't matter what country or culture you're from, generations don't just show up. They're shaped by the people who came before them, the societal structures that are in place, and the way that life happens wherever these youth are growing up. So in that sense, we share something great between, across all the generational research all over the world, is that there are influences. So I'm going to go over some of the influences that have influenced our data, and they're generalized influences that likely influence the data that is coming out of the study that took place here. And so while that team is going to be uncovering how those influences made a difference, we're going to share with you just a little bit about how they can make a difference. So the first thing is, we can all agree that in the last 15, 20 years, technology has advanced rapidly. I could probably look around and see how many of you have a laptop, a tablet, or a smartphone right in your hands now. That wasn't possible necessarily, at least with smartphones and tablets 15 years ago. And our young people are going to college with these in their backpacks and in their hands. When I was in college, we didn't even have the internet. We went to the library and we found a book, and we went to the shelf and just hoped that someone put it back where it was supposed to be. That was my college experience, and I bet many of you probably had that same kind of experience. But this generation can do all of their research right through their own digital technology without ever having to leave their rooms. They can do anything without having to leave their rooms. Look at this woman up here. She's on a beautiful mountain, and I'm thinking that she's looking at her phone to take a picture, which may be true. She might also be texting a friend saying, these mountains are beautiful, look around. She might also be getting on her bank account, transferring money. She might be buying something on Amazon. She might be Skyping with grandma. I don't know what she's doing because she can do pretty much anything that she wants from anywhere that she wants. That is really different when you think about the college students that are coming to us that have an expectation of 24/7 access to just about anything. And while many of us as older people know that we like 24/7 access to everything, we also can remember a time when you didn't have that, and our expectations are a bit lower. So when colleges close their doors and teachers aren't available, right, and the office hours are over, these students can access everything else in their lives except for us, and except for those of us in the communities that are working in institutions, especially for those of you, I know there's many teachers out here today, that we close our doors, students wait. And I think that's okay. I have no preference of it any other way. However, it isn't consistent with the experience that they're having in other areas of their lives. So it's important for us to remember this as a context. Politics, the political institution, the government structures, laws of our countries, our local laws, these all impact the way that our Generation Z people see and experience the world. In the United States, we had an election in 2016. It's no surprise to probably many of you because our president is pretty well known around the world now, if you're on Twitter. Anyways, just a change in our own political administration has changed and impacted some of the views of our Generation Z youth. We've had several different experiences where environmental policies have been changed with our new administration, which has mobilized our young people to take the environment and issues around the environment much more seriously. We were on a much more forward trajectory of environmentalism, and now we're moving in some cases backwards. And many of our young people know that. And so they have been mobilized around these issues. And while every country, every locality has their issues, they're constantly changing and constantly influencing a generation that, when we did our study in 2014, didn't seem to have any real preference around the environment. We did another study in 2017. The environment was on the forefront of their minds. So we have to understand that our generations are fluid as our laws change and as our structures change. The economy also has a major influence on our young people. Think about it. Many of them are coming to college, or at least graduating from their secondary or high school to go out and get a job. And if the economy isn't very good and there aren't a lot of jobs, these young people have particular perspectives about the world, or they may go about different avenues to try to gain employment. The economy can also change their perspectives on how they see perhaps owning a home, traveling, raising a family. Should I start a family now? Can I afford to have kids? What's interesting is that for us in the US, the economy played a major role in a lot of the studies that we have done and that we have seen around Generation Z. We had our recession and housing bubble crisis that happened in around 2008, 2009. And these were young kids. We called this group the recession kids. And in the United States, about 3/4 of people were affected by the recession, meaning their families lost jobs, homes. Something happened that impacted their families economically. So these kids have learned somewhere, somehow, that they have to be very cautious with their spending. They have to be really, mindful of saving money. I'll tell you an interesting story about this. I have a daughter. She's 9 years old. And when she was 7, we decided to go on a vacation. And my mother gave my daughter $10 and said, spend this on a souvenir that you would like on the trip. So every time we went to a gift shop, I would say, hey, would you like to get something at the gift shop with your $10? No, mommy, I'm saving the money. Now, mind you, she's 7 years old. I'm saving the money, I'm saving it. Oh, okay. So we would go to the next place. We were driving on our road trip. So we'd go to the next place. Would you like to get something here? No, Mommy, I'm saving it. I'm saving my money. So we get to the very last stop, and I said, this is our last stop. Are you going to spend that $10 that Grandma gave you? No, Mommy, I'm going to save it. I said, what are you saving it for? This is our last stop. And she said, just in case we need it. So what's interesting about that, well, besides that, I also told her, well, if you don't spend the $10, you have to give it back to Grandma. So, of course, we spent that money really fast. But what the interesting part about this is that at 7 years old, she already had the idea in her head that we needed to save every dollar that we had. Now, I was fortunate. I didn't lose my job, nor did I lose my home during the recession. So she really didn't have much of a personal impact. But for whatever reason, the people around her and the messages that she was getting at 7 years old was, you need to save your money. So think about it. However your economy is going, whether it's going well or not going well, these messages are translating to even our youngest children that they carry with them to shape the way that they go about navigating the world. And we've seen in our studies and multiple other studies that this is a very financially conservative generation, at least from our data in the US, and we can see it directly tied back to the economy. We're also living in a time of the sharing economy, and we see this all over the world. This is nothing specific to the United States. You all have Uber. I'm assuming you have Airbnb, although I haven't stayed in one here. These are worldwide phenomenons of the sharing economy. Basically, what we're saying is, you don't need to buy anything anymore, you just rent it. And if you have something that you don't use very often, you can rent it to other people for a profit. So who wouldn't want to participate in the sharing economy? Our young people see that not only do they not have to commit money to purchase their own things, that they can actually make a profit off of the very little that they have. There was a college student in Boston, Massachusetts, who decided he was living in a college dormitory that was on the college campus. He was going to be away for the weekend, and he put his college dormitory room up on Airbnb. Well, the university did not like that, because you can imagine the legal issues with having people who are not supposed to be on the college campus in the room. But there was no policy in place that told him he wasn't allowed to do that. So for him, he was thinking, hey, I'm going to make some money off of this. I'm not staying there this weekend. Why should I lose out on the opportunity to make a profit? So our young people are already seeing the sharing economy as really influential in their career decisions and in their entrepreneurial spirit that they have. Disaster. Well, we can argue whether today has more natural disasters and horrible things happening around the world, typhoons and hurricanes and earthquakes. It probably, I don't know, I'm not someone who works with the climate and weather, but I can probably venture to say that while there isn't more necessarily today, there's probably more coverage of it today. Meaning, you can get online and you can see pictures and videos, and you can connect with your global networks of friends that live all over the place. When I was young, my friends lived within a block from me. They lived just around my neighborhood. I didn't have friends far away. I had one pen pal. That was it. Now, our young people, their networks are so global that they understand and see disaster that isn't even local to them right on the social media because it's happening with their friends. So imagine how this is impacting their mental health and their own feeling of safety. There's serious implications for this. There's a phenomenon called vicarious trauma. Vicarious trauma usually affects people who work as firefighters, police officers, in emergency medicine, people who are on the front lines of seeing disaster, tragedy, misfortune. But what's happening is because we can live feed events happening, we can see photos, we can watch videos, we are having young people that don't know not to click that video on YouTube, and they watch these terrible things, and they're having traumatic experiences as if they were first responders. That is, as an adult, as someone who's much older, I know not to click the button on the video to watch something unfold. But as an 18-year-old, I'm pretty curious. We had an incident happen in the United States where a young African-American man was pulled over by a police officer, and his girlfriend was in the car, and there was a disagreement as to why he was pulled over, and it ended up being that the police officer shot and killed the man at just a general traffic stop. It was a tragedy. It was horrible. What happened was the girlfriend recorded the entire thing on on YouTube. She had it on a video and then recorded it and put it on YouTube so everybody could watch how unjust this was. This has millions and millions of views. And I know that it's not many of us around the room that are watching this. It's 16, 17, 18-year-olds who are curious about seeing disaster unfold in front of them. Violence. Acts of violence. These are different necessarily, a little bit like I talked about with the young man, but violence. In the United States, what was very interesting is in 2014, the data you're going to see, we're not going to talk about this other set of data, but I will share a little bit with you. We couldn't seem to find an issue that they really rallied around, like their issue of their generation, right? In the 1960s in the United States was our civil rights movement. We had Martin Luther King, and we could see a generation rally around an issue. We don't see that with Generation Z, or at least we didn't. This past February, we had yet another school shooting. It's an epidemic in the United States, and we cannot seem to get it under control. This particular shooting, though, was in Parkland, Florida, and it woke these young people up. They have mobilized. They created March for Our Lives and gathered many people around to come together in solidarity for gun control. They've talked to politicians. They've had protests. They've boycotted. Now you're starting to see many members of this generation rally around gun control. Did we know that was going to happen before February? No. We had no idea. Like I said, as events unfold in our own societies, that awakens what is inside of these young people to say, this is what I'm going to rally around, and this is what's important to me. Human rights issues. And while we see this in across the world, and they're different in different spaces, although we found some great similarities we'll talk about. Things around women's rights, racial equality. We found issues around gay and lesbian rights. These are things that are impacting the way that these young people interact with others and what they expect of their society to do. As the most racially diverse generation in the United States, it's not surprising that this group of young people has a lot of friends that are different than they are. They don't want policies and laws that make these people have less rights. So these are important factors that are influencing how they're behaving. The media, and while the media can be influential anywhere, for our experience in the United States, we're having a lot of attention to this concept of fake news. Fake news. Sometimes news is fake. Sometimes news is real and called fake news. But what's happening is it's confusing some younger people who aren't and don't have the experience of being able to distinguish what is good information and what is not. So what's happening is that we're seeing a lot of either distrust, everything is a lie, or everything is the truth, and it's very confusing in the middle about what these young people are experiencing. Interestingly, though, when we look at some of the more localized factors that influence this generation, parents are one of the most. For the most part, the parents of Generation Z are Generation X, born in the early 60s to the early 80s. So most Gen Z youth fall within that age range. Now, some of the younger Gen Z may have millennial parents, which were born in the mid-80s to mid-90s. And some of the older ones might have baby boomer parents, which were born in the 40s to the 60s. But for the most part, you're going to see Generation X are the parents of Generation Z. Now, what's interesting is when baby boomers were raising their millennial children, they raised them to have things that they didn't have when they were younger. So they wanted to give them the things that they didn't have. So their kids turned out fairly different than the baby boomer parents. Generation X, on the other hand, is parenting their Generation Z kids to be very similar to them. So we're seeing some similar characteristics. We're seeing this idea of being pragmatic or, independent. Those kinds of things are happening with this young generation, and you're going to see that in our comparative data. So parents have a great influence. Siblings also have a great influence. If the Generation Z has older siblings that are millennials, you might see them taking on more millennial characteristics. Or maybe they have younger siblings, which the generation after Generation Z is Generation Alpha. And those young ones, they may be taking on characteristics. So there is some fluidity. Another major influence are their peers. While their parents are their number one role models, at least in the data in the United States, their peers are their biggest influencers. So if someone from Generation Z wants to buy a new pair of shoes, rather than looking online and seeing all of the reviews for that pair of shoes, they might have 5-star reviews for 100,000 people. But if their best friend says, no, you won't like those shoes, they won't buy them. Because they take their peers' word as much stronger than they take the collective. And finally, teachers. We were able to discern this from a global study on Generation Z. Came up, and it's come up in some US studies as well, as teachers have a major influence on Generation Z. Because they are part of the inner circle. As a Gen Xer, when I was younger, the people who influenced me were mostly people that were on TV. Celebrities and movie stars and rock stars. They could get up and pretty much tell me to buy anything on a commercial, and I would buy it. But Generation Z wants their inner circle, their most trusted people, to help them make their life's choices. So these are just some of the influences that we've seen, but we know transcend cultural and national boundaries because we know that they're influential in many, many ways. And so while our data provides a great snapshot for a time and place right now, we understand that it's also fluid as our society and as our world continues to evolve. And new inventions come about, new tragedies and disasters, and new laws and policies. So we continue to keep watching this generation, but we do have some fabulous data for you to help make sense of what we've learned.
So a little bit about our 2014 study. We had roughly 16 institutions in the United States that were participating. Those were both 2-year and 4-year schools, and so we were able to get a little bit of a differentiation among the types of students and the types of institutions, and that was nationally diverse in terms of they were from all over the United States. We had over 1,200 students that started our survey, over 1,100 that actually were meeting the age qualification of being born after 1995. So we did lose a little bit between the beginning. For each individual measure, each individual scale that we present, we typically have a range of responses between 614 and 759. And what we will indicate that throughout when we're presenting our data of our response rate for each of our scales. We similarly had a higher representation of women and female students responding to our survey. So within our study, we asked the exact same characteristics of American college students, and these were our most most described, most frequently selected as greatly describing me. And so it's very interesting. Our next slide, we're going to be able to show you comparison of the top descriptions and top characteristics of both student groups. And so we're seeing that the American students were identifying more so along the lines of loyal, thoughtful, determined, compassionate, and open-minded, and you're probably starting to see some similarities already. It's interesting to be able to highlight those in the next slide. And I think that we're starting to get a clearer picture, a consistent picture that some of these characteristics in the way that Generation Z, regardless of where they grew up and where they're from, are identifying the same way. And so as Corey was talking about these larger contextual factors, some of maybe that on a global scale is starting to shape the identity of this young generation.
So when we were able to compare the data, we looked at the top 6 characteristics that our survey participants from both studies indicated, and 4 of the 6 characteristics are the same. Actually, the first one is the same, the strongest one is the same for both. It's loyal. Then we had open-minded, showed up in both. It showed up a little bit lower on the US, but it still showed up. Determined and responsible. And interestingly, the other ones that are not highlighted don't show up too far down the list either. So there's a lot of similarities. While our cultures and our nations and their experiences may be different, there are some great similarities in the characteristics between both cohorts that took this study. One of the other things that we wanted to make sure we said is our study participant numbers were pretty low, and we know that. We don't want to say that all of our information is going to be perfectly applied to everybody across both countries. But what we can say is that over the last several years, Meghan and I have looked at other much larger studies to compare our data to, and it's pretty accurate. So while we have a small number of people who took our survey, it's compared to the larger data, it's pretty much saying the same thing. So we're finding a lot of consistency across studies. So one of the studies we did want to show you that just to kind of show the consistency is it's actually from an organization called the VIA Institute on Character. And they're out of the United States, and it's an organization that has an online evaluation that students can take to figure out what their top 5 strengths are, the things that they're best at. And they take this survey, basically, and they fill it out, and they get a report at the end. And this is a worldwide initiative. So we were able to work with the VIA Institute, and we were able to get all of the data for the 155,215 Generation Z US college students who took the instrument. And then we were able to get it for the 7,039 students in Brazil, not Brazilian students in the US, but students in Brazil who took the instrument in Portuguese. We were able to get the data for that and found the similarities are striking. Honesty, number 1. If you go back and you look at this, that aligns a lot with loyalty, honesty, loyalty, that idea of integrity, right? You see kindness, fairness, judgment is being able to, not being judgmental, but actually being able to look at a situation and make a good decision. And you see a lot of the similarities. Look, of these top 5, 4 of the 5 are the same. So while our data might be small, and we find similarities, larger data sets are also finding a lot of the same kinds of data. Their lowest ranked strength from this was self-regulation, the ability to manage their own affairs. Not surprising, they're young people. I bet that's probably a worldwide phenomenon. But just to give you an idea of how this compares across other data sets, we're finding a lot of similarities.
So when we asked the American students in 2014 what were the things that greatly motivated them, these are the top characteristics or motivations that are driving students in our universities. And so we're seeing that their top motivation is not wanting to let other people down. And we see a common theme among the respondents in the US study of this idea of relationally focused motivation. Advocating for something they believe in really ties into this idea of wanting to change the world, wanting to make an impact on other people. And so we see making a difference fall right behind this idea of advocating for something they believe in, finding a cause they rally around, and doing good things for other people are very linked with those two. But at the same time, they're also wanting to, very similar to the students in the Brazil study, wanting to see the fruits of their labor. They want to credit towards when they are doing something well. They want, maybe it's a badge or an indicator that they've done good work. They want to be acknowledged for that, but not in a public setting. And we'll talk about what does not motivate them in a minute. But this idea that if they are going to be volunteering their time or they're going to be involved in something, they want to receive some sort of credit. And that links to this idea of an opportunity for advancement. They're going to be motivated by this idea of building a career or being able to go to the next level in whatever that experience might be. And we started to think about what might be influencing these motivations. And when I think about this idea of opportunity for advancement or credit for something, they're a generation that's grown up playing video games, where you are trying to always go to the next level. You might not necessarily do the whole video game in one day, but you're doing little chunks maybe at a time, and you're playing to get to the next level, to level 15. And they're starting to think about the way that they learn that way, and they think about the way that they might be looking at building their career in that way. So this idea of they're very motivated by wanting to help other people, not let other people down. And in a personal sense, also, how do they receive credit for the work that they are doing and the efforts that they're putting forth?
All right. In comparing these, there was a much longer list for the Brazil data than there was the U.S. We just picked a few of them to compare with. What's interesting about this is we see a lot of the same motivations. And while this list, if it went on, it would have a lot more yellow as we go down. The idea is that they're both motivated by two different factors: achievement and impact. And we're finding that with the Brazil data, it starts with achievement. I want to do something great. I want to learn something. I want to get credit. I want to advance. I want to achieve. And then we're finding after that, making an impact is important, making a difference, leaving a legacy, advocating for something you believe in. We're finding the opposite with the United States data. We're finding that impact falls first and achievement falls second. Now, what's interesting about it is that both of those are really important, impact and achievement. There were almost 30 different choices for them to have. And for the fact that they actually probably had many in the top 10, if we were to expand this, that were actually similar, just in different orders, is pretty telling. Both of these cohorts want to make a difference, and they want to achieve something. They want to do something. And so I think that's really interesting as we look forward to see what motivates them in the classroom, what motivates them in their workplaces and in their communities is going to be achievement and impact.
For U.S. data, we're seeing, we'll do a comparison next, but we're seeing some similarity of this idea of acceptance by other people and knowing that someone will return the favor very low. So knowing that someone might return the favor, so if they're doing something good, they have very little, they're not motivated by the fact that someone might pay them back in doing a good deed for them, which we think is very interesting. It's like they almost have a low expectation of other people, which is interesting because they care so much about impacting other people. So maybe they're actually doing good things out of just being good people and being kind. We found it interesting, even though that they are very motivated by credit and receiving recognition for their hard work, they don't want that in a public setting, so a big award ceremony or a lot of attention on them. They just want to be acknowledged, but maybe it's not in that large setting. It might actually be more on a one-to-one individual basis that they want to receive that recognition and then acceptance by others. And when we started to find what is the common thread throughout all of this, is it's very much so the perception of other people does not necessarily matter as much to them in terms of motivation. So they're not seeking out the acceptance of other people. They're not seeking out this public recognition. And I think that's an interesting piece of it. As much as they care about impacting people and they care about solving issues, the acceptance of other people is not what they're looking for, and they're not motivated by.
And when we compare the two, you see a lot of similarities, right? You see that there is a crossover of two. The two that are different, competition and public recognition, if you think about it, it's not really all that different. It's this idea that someone else is evaluating their worth. It's this idea that you are coming out ahead or not, and other people are judging that and maybe recognizing that. And especially with competition that might be public, where other people would learn of the result. That could be a form of public recognition. So we see in this, the theme that kind of cuts through all of this is this idea that I don't really need approval from others. I don't need accolades from others in order to be motivated. I don't need that. I want to know that I'm making a difference for other people, but I don't need for them to approve of me in order for me to be motivated.
So we found some very similar findings with communication. An important context, we took this data in 2014 and we've seen a little bit of evolution when we think about the difference between text messaging and instant messaging. They've kind of started to look very similar. You have WhatsApp, you have, you even have Google Chat or email-based chat that is mobile. And so in the minds of Generation Z, instant messaging and text messaging are almost one and the same. It just depends on if it's like a text message or if it's going through Facebook Messenger or WhatsApp. And so that's an interesting finding, but I think the one that stands out the most is that it's still connected in this idea of in-person communication is the most preferred far and away, with text messaging right behind that. And they also do not like phone calls and emails in the US. And we had dinner at Gustavo's house last night. It was great talking with his Gen Z daughters. And the youngest one said, no, we hate email. I just have email to have other social media accounts. Would never check my email. So it's very interesting to kind of see that data become alive in front of us. And from anyone trying to connect with students, we know that sometimes an email might be a great way to get a lot of information to them about a class, but is it the fastest and most effective way? And I think that helps us start to think about how we utilize that, and do we move more towards WhatsApp and instant messaging and text messaging opportunities? Thinking more about the context of what has shaped American perspectives on this, we were able to gather qualitative data when we did our first study, and we got many responses that talked about how they even text message their teachers through high school. Their teachers have mobile phones that they can talk to their students on. They text their parents. So they're not utilizing email, or they're not required to utilize email until they're getting to professional spaces like college or a job. And we had many responses that would say, I only use email for my boss or my professors, or associating it just with college. And so it's something that they actually haven't potentially developed the habit of having to utilize email. And with phone calls, they might actually prefer to FaceTime or video chat or Skype to be able to connect and see and almost have an alternative to an in-person setting. So we're seeing some interesting similarities among the communication preferences.
And when you compare the data, it's overwhelming that in-person, face-to-face communication is preferred by both, in both studies, by far. Interesting, a lot of people don't imagine that a generation that looks like this all the time on their phones is actually really craving that personal connection in person. But in many cases, they are. And I was at a college campus about a year ago, and I was giving a talk, and I had someone there from their health center who said that they had just purchased an online nutrition assessment. So students would fill out the assessment, and it would give them a report about recommendations for what they should be eating. And the school spent a lot of money on this. Well, about 2 weeks after they launched it, they started getting calls. And they said, when do I get to meet with somebody to talk about my report? And they got so many calls that they had to hire somebody temporarily to meet one-on-one, face-to-face with these students. So we're going to be seeing more calls for face-to-face interaction. Just because we can put something online doesn't mean that that's how they only want to receive it. Like Meghan had mentioned before, if you look at these other areas, texting and instant messaging, when we looked at them together, they were about the same. Our students really like messaging. After that, we know that they don't like talking on the phone and they don't like email. So we do see some consistency in that. They're going to be moving even further away from things like email as there's more text chat that they're able to do. And there may be more opportunities or challenges in having to teach them appropriate etiquette around the phone and email, because we're not sure that they know exactly how to greet people in an email or answer their phone properly. These are little things that we don't really think much about, but are obviously affecting both groups. For social media use, we actually compared how they're using different platforms. We found some data that is striking in some sense. If you look at the left-hand side for the in Brazil column, you will see that there's a lot of sharing personal information, using social media to share personal information. On the US side, we see a lot of keeping up with others. So basically, our students in the US are reading your Brazil students' social media platforms. But what we do see some similarities in is the gaining of new knowledge. They're going to different places than some of us might imagine to get information, to learn something. They're going to blogs, they're going to YouTube, virtual pin boards like Pinterest, and they're going to online forums. They want real people to tell them real information. They don't want something formal. This goes back to the idea of their inner circles are very influential to them. But when we look at where they're really getting their information, while they're getting them on all these sites, it is YouTube. Like Gustavo said, YouTube is the channel that they go to. When I want to look up something that I don't know, I get on Google, right? I might, if I want to maybe make a new recipe, I get on Google and I look up a recipe and I follow that recipe and I make dinner. Gen Z will get on YouTube and they'll watch somebody preparing the dish. That is how they are learning how to make that recipe. It's a very different learning style. It's a very different space as to where they're getting information and the credibility of that information. So while we do see some similarities in where they're learning, we're seeing very large differences in how they're sharing and consuming that information.
So we actually have a very exactly identical order in how our students were reporting that they're often or always engaging in these styles when working with other people. So then when they are working in groups, they also prefer to dive in, get things done, execute tasks, and then right behind that is this idea of thinking, researching, developing answers to questions. And I always say that that's a very good partnership of those two preferences of working with other people, of they're natural problem solvers. So do we include these young people in our problem solving scenarios in our organizations? Something to note is throughout the slides, we do have, we asked some questions just a little bit different. In the US study, they were able to select more than one option. So they felt that they identified often or always with more than one option in this scale. And so we are seeing a little bit elevated in terms of, if you go back to a little bit higher, the US students might have chosen one or more options to some of these questions. And so we do want to note that throughout the presentation where that was an option and how that might influence it, but some of the general themes are going to stay the same. So just a small nuance in that piece of data.
And to compare, we have the same exact order in terms of the most prominent ways in which students like to work with others. Doing is their preference. I don't want to be in charge, just tell me what I need to do. Thinking, strategizing, relating with others, and then leading. We found in our further studies that students in the United States are not very comfortable with the word leader. Many of them don't want to be in the leadership position. They don't want to be in charge. They see themselves having a lot of leadership ability, but they don't want to actually be in that leader role. So seeing this consistency is quite interesting. And like Meghan mentioned, the percentages are much higher for the US. So the students are engaging in multiple roles. It's role shifting. They might take on the role of doing, and then the next time they meet with the group, take on the role of thinking. Whereas the Brazil data is smaller, meaning that those students like to stick to a particular role more frequently and aren't shifting quite as much. So one of the things we wanted to talk about, we did some comparative data on social issues that both of our study participants cared about and how they engaged with those issues. Well, we could present you 20 slides of all of the data. We actually wrote it all around the classroom on your wonderful walls. It was great. We're not going to put all of that out here for you. What we are going to do is just share with you some of the findings of the similarities and the differences. So in terms of engagement, we're talking about things that students care about, things that young people care about, and how they're trying to impact or make a difference in their communities. And while we keep seeing this idea of making a difference coming up over and over in the data, that this is what this generation wants to do, this is how they're doing it. So we asked the students across the top, depending on the social issue, what kinds of behaviors would you be willing to engage in? So, for instance, if it's an issue about the environment, for instance, understanding the issue. How many of you think you really understand the issue of the environment? How do you go out of your way to learn about it? The next one is volunteering. How many of you go out and spend your time helping with this issue? Change behavior. Do you actually change your personal behavior? Are you more likely to recycle, for instance, because you are aware of the issues of the environment? And then, are you willing to engage in activities? Do you engage in activities? Do you actually go out and maybe work with an organization or protest or do something that tries to make a change? So we found some findings that were very consistent in this area. For understanding the issue, for both Brazil and the US, we found that that is the largest form or the highest form of engagement that students are doing. Not surprising, because it's fairly easy to educate yourself without having to commit to doing anything other than looking on YouTube or online. That is a pretty low level commitment, not surprising, but it is the highest form of engagement. They see themselves as pretty knowledgeable about a variety of issues. We were surprised our numbers were very high on many of the social issues. We found across both studies that the lowest form of engagement was volunteering. And so going out in their community and doing service to help with the issue was the lowest across all social issues. For changing behavior, we found that the number one and number two issues that they were most likely, that most of them were changing their behavior around, were the same for both of our studies. Number one was the environment, and number two was healthy and safe food. We also found that engaging in activities, we found that the top two areas that both felt that they wanted to go out and make a difference, maybe, change laws or engage in something that would make a major change, were both around the issues of education and gay rights. So we found some real consistencies in the social issues that they're doing work around and how they're actually engaging in those behaviors. The differences, though, we found a pretty substantial difference in the understanding the issue and volunteering. And while they're both, we found in this previous slide that understanding the issue was the highest form of engagement and volunteering was the lowest form of engagement, when you look at it like this, actually, Brazil, understanding the issue was far higher for most issues than it was for the US. The Brazil students identified knowing much more about many more issues than the US students did. But on the flip side, the US students, while still having pretty low volunteer rates, had much higher volunteer rates than those in Brazil. And so we did see a real flip in these two particular areas. And as we continue to interpret the data and look much more deeply, we'll be able to look specifically at social issues one by one and be able to report out on those. But this should give you a good snapshot of the kind of data that we have found.
So from our United States study, we find almost identical, and we'll give you that comparison. The results are a little bit, again, elevated in percentage-wise, but a similar perspective and preference on utilizing logic-based learning, problem solving as a learning method with experience and this hands-on aspect of it. And if you think back to the interpersonal style of how they like to do and think, it's starting to make a connection with their learning style as well. So not only when they're working with other people, but when they're in learning settings, having an opportunity to apply problem solving and in a hands-on capacity is important. But this idea of practical knowledge is, I think, something that presents a new challenge sometimes for educators of students might question the utility of what we're talking about in classrooms and making that connection to why am I sitting in a history theory class? How does that apply to my life outside of these walls? And I think that's something that would benefit maybe if our students are not recognizing that utility from the very beginning, it's a new frontier for us to start to explain why are we talking about the very basic levels of a subject when I feel like I'm sort of already in, like I understand it, or helping them draw larger connections to the practical use. I do a lot of education in more extracurricular fashion with student organizations and clubs and that kind of stuff on campuses, and helping students recognize why being involved in that club applies outside of school is an aspect of that practical knowledge, and helping them realize that if they are in charge of their organization's budget or financing is going to help them down the road in their career. And so sometimes making that draw to tie into that learning style and that learning preference has been something I've seen in my my practice of being able to work with students and help them make that connection.
So again, when looking at the comparison, this is similar to interpersonal styles. We had the same exact order of learning, of preferences. But like interpersonal styles, and as Meghan said, the percentages were much higher for US students, meaning that they prefer many different styles and they go in and out of those styles, whereas for Brazil, it might be that those students prefer one particular style over another. But we do see some real flow with this. Now, what's interesting about this, looking at imagination as being low, if you look at the World Economic Forum's list of jobs for the 21st century and things that are emerging around the world that students, graduates, college graduates in particular, need to be able to do is around areas of creativity. Yet they don't really prefer to do this, yet they know that some of these jobs are going to be really critical to have the skill of creativity and creative thinking.
So we start to see a little bit of difference here, but not major differences. We're still seeing that intrapersonal, so this idea of learning by yourself, learning in an individual setting, is something that is a preferred method of how to take in information for US students. And I think that's interesting because we think that group work is fantastic, whereas this might actually be putting students in an uncomfortable situation. Not to say we have to get rid of group work, but we can notice that intrapersonal, that idea of working and learning together, is very low for US students. We're still seeing kinesthetic learning, so learning by doing, learning by activity is still high, along with logical, again, problem solving. That's, again, related to their learning style. So these methods of teaching that are greatly effective, we see our top three have some characteristic, but we do see a drop off after that.
As for the comparison, as you can see, intrapersonal and kinesthetic seem to be pretty common ways between both populations in order to be able to learn. The difference was, we saw with Brazil, the number one was actually linguistic, is hearing lectures or learning information by listening or reading or using words. That didn't really appear very high for our students. I think that they are kind of tired of the typical lecture and they wanted something different. They put logical, which comes from the notion of problem-based learning. We do a lot of that in the United States where students are given a scenario and they have to solve it. So it's not surprising that logic showed up very high. But we do see for intrapersonal, which is self-learning, and kinesthetic, which is experiential learning, those seem to be pretty popular. And experiential learning has been common throughout many generations. That hands-on learning by doing is something that we've been using for many years and find it very successful with many different age groups. So that isn't surprising. But what is the shift to the intrapersonal. And seeing that across both cultures is quite interesting. And it probably stems from the ability to self-direct your own learning by getting information off of the internet. That wasn't the case before. You had to interact with other people to get information, unless you read it in a book. But now you can just get on your phone or get on your laptop at any time and find out the information that you need, essentially engaging in intrapersonal learning. We did find that both of us shared the least effective method. Our students said the naturalist method, which is basically going outside. They don't really want to sit under a tree and learn. So it seems to be pretty consistent across both study populations. So while I enjoy some fresh air, they might rather sit inside and be on their iPhones. Well, we really appreciate the opportunity to be here and share with you our data, and we're really interested and excited that our data is very similar. And we have already, we've already analyzed our qualitative data. And so once the team here analyzes it, we'll have more comparisons, even much further than what we had here. So that's really exciting for us on our next steps.
Yeah, it's been incredible to be here, so thank you for having us. But it's really wonderful to be able to work with the team here, but then also see some of this data and information come to life, not only in our day-to-day work, but start to understand how there's some more so a lot of similarities we see among these groups, but also some really unique differences. And I think that we're excited to kind of continue this exploration of what are those differences, what's shaping those differences, but what are almost the universal trends that are coming throughout this information. So we're excited for what's up next, and we can't wait, and we've been so thankful for this experience.
So thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. First of all, I'd like to congratulate you on your research, and I'm absolutely sure that it's going to make a lot of difference in our environment as school sectors, right? I'm not very sure if you had sort of a question of how the students would be active or autonomous in their learning. For example, what have you been doing or what are you planning to do in order to achieve your aims? Because they want to achieve their aims to make impact into the society, but what have they been doing really to achieve these aims? I don't know if this question was there or not. Thank you.
That's a great question. We didn't ask one that specifically asked that, but we did get information that helped us understand maybe a response to that. The kinds of things that they're doing to more specifically prepare for their careers is a lot of them are seeking out internships, and they want to be able to get some actual practical hands-on experience in their communities. We have in the United States, usually our students, if we're lucky, maybe do one internship during college. This group is looking to do 2 to 3 internships during their college career. So they want to go get practical experience. Some of them are saying that they don't want to go to college yet because they're not sure what they want to do, and they want to go try something before they go and commit themselves to a degree. And in the United States, the cost is getting so expensive that that's a really important decision that students are being asked to make at 17 and 18 years old. So some of the things they're doing is really trying to go out and get real life experience to figure out what they want to do with their lives before they invest time and money into making those decisions. So that's one thing that we found.
And I think that they're doing that at an earlier age, too. I think that in the young people I've talked with, I didn't think about an internship in college till my 3rd year. Maybe I was late, but there are younger students before they even get to college having done an internship. So thinking about it even earlier, I think we start thinking about the secondary education in high school, about what are the options for those flexible learning environments to allow for a student maybe to take the afternoon off of their normal classes in high school to go do an internship or go do a practicum or a practical based learning, maybe a vocational rotation, if you will, to job shadow. So thinking about how that even might start to trickle into the younger grades.
And to add to that, too, they're doing more entrepreneurial initiatives, we're finding from US data, but there is some global data that shows that, too, where the students, young, especially 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds, might have their own business. They might be selling things online, or they might be producing information. They are taking their own career destinies into their own hands at a very, very young age, and they're crafting it and shaping it so that by the time they're ready to go out into the workforce, they're ready to go. So they're taking some ownership of those experiences themselves.
Hey, good morning. Thank you very much, and congratulations for the study, for the data. I guess I think that as we move forward, we might end up realizing that these are all kids from everywhere, right? Because the similarities between the results in the US and in Brazil are just striking, and it's amazing. But something that I got really curious about is based on some research I did back in 2014-15, trying to find out what the primary characteristics of good teachers are from the perception of the students. So I gave them a list of 8 characteristics, and I asked them to choose up to 4 of them. Not exactly 4, but they could choose between 1 and 4 characteristics. And aside from the basics, I mean, knowing the subject and being able to do a good delivery of in class, one thing that called my attention was the fact that the 2 least chosen aspects were the first one, authority from the teacher. I mean, authority in position from the discipline standpoint, right? And the least chosen was justice in evaluations. So did you have the chance in your study to look into their perception of evaluation, of how they perceive it as something that is still important, or if on a different way, it's something that it's maybe necessary, but they don't give it as much of an importance as compared to maybe their own perception of having learned something in the process?
That's a really interesting question. We didn't ask that because the nature of evaluation is probably a little different in the U.S. in terms of what students place on that. Some students don't really care about it. It's sad to say, it's really awful. But and so once I'm responding, I'm going to probably turn it over to them to respond on if they found anything. But I will tell you one of the things that we did find in our qualitative data. We did ask a question similar to the one that they put up. And we found very similar findings in what the role of a teacher is. And we found that it's someone who's more of a facilitator and an advisor rather than an authoritative knowledge disseminator. While they like to impart knowledge and share knowledge, the idea that there's a power dynamic was really different, which may be why evaluations didn't come up, because that seems to be a very power-laden kind of a situation. Actually, we didn't see one single response that had to do with any kind of evaluative measures, assignments, or anything related to that. One of the things, though, that did come up in our study that we haven't talked about yet was that they wanted their teachers to be passionate. They wanted them to really deeply care about the subject that they were teaching. They don't care what the subject is. They just want to feel that their teacher loves what they're doing because they said that helps them become more passionate. So very interesting question. I want to turn it over to you all to see if you had any responses about the evaluation. I think that's fascinating.
And connected to this idea, you brought up authority and where that might be coming from. I think that it also stems from their relationship with their parents. We know that our research is telling us that their parents are their #1 role models, and not just they look up to their parents. They're included in family decisions. They're included in a lot of authority conversations even within the family, so they might view adult relationships very differently and feel comfortable that when they have someone like an authoritative teacher that's actually going against the grain of their experience with adults. And I think that those are their outliers, and what they don't like, they like to be treated like adults even if they are kids, which is an interesting kind of dichotomy. And so I think that might actually have, we don't have something that's conclusive to say that, but I think that there's a thread there of why teachers were such influential role models in their decision making, why teachers kind of raised up there. In many ways, your teachers are your second parents when you're not at home.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I was thinking about the data, and 2 elements got my attention. Leadership and imagination. I think this is the generation probably that is facing the highest level of complexity in human history. And why these 2 elements are so low, I don't know if I got it right, but for instance, maybe they have a different view of leadership, or maybe imagination is, we give space to imagination in college or not. I would like to, to understand better why these 2 elements are not so in focus. Thank you.
We know in the United States, one of the things that happened in the early 2000s was we had an increase in standardized testing. So the students had to take a lot of tests, somewhere between 18 and 20 tests a year, just to report results back to the state. What happened was they took away, in order to make time for these, they took away art classes, PE classes, or physical education classes, and music, theater, because they couldn't take away math and writing and so forth. So we have a whole generation of kids that went to school in the United States that lost opportunity to express themselves in all the different physical and emotional and mental ways that all of those classes offered. And then what ended up happening is we then bring them to college and we say, the world is very complex. You need to have very imaginative and creative thinking, and you need to be able to solve all these problems, and you need to step up and take leadership. But none of them have even played a sport because they didn't have physical education, so they didn't take on those kinds of leadership roles, and they didn't do the art classes. So here they are being tasked with almost an impossible expectation, where we have taken out, in our case, 13 years worth of opportunities for them to gain creativity and the ability to develop leadership, and then we put them in a situation where we say, these are the two most important things you're going to need for today or for the future of society. So what's happening in the United States is we're starting to realize that. And we have an initiative called STEM, which is science, technology, engineering, and math. And we have STEM schools, and we have STEM programs. Just recently, they've added the A to STEM. They call them STEAM, and they added arts back because finally people are realizing that these young kids were not getting an opportunity to develop their imagination and their creativity, and are now putting these classes back into schools because they know the importance. But in the meantime, we have about 15 years of kids in the United States who lost out on a lot of that opportunity. So for us, we have a real strong explanation as how we see it, but they're coming to college, and now we have to try to figure out how to help them, how to develop their creativity and develop their leadership, especially when, since they didn't get it, they're also not seeing that it's important as much because they haven't had that experience.
I think when we talk about, you bring up leadership as well, this idea of traditional leadership, with technology, we see almost every waking moment of people we've envisioned as leaders, but we also see them stumble and fall publicly. And so some of them might not want to be in that spotlight to be the leader per se, but they're still contributing things that they would identify that a leader might contribute, care and concern for other people. And so as you've brought up, I think there will be probably a redefinition of leadership, and it might not necessarily be the person per se, but the activity in which they're engaging in. I think that comes from an educational perspective, that we start to help them redefine what it means to be a leader, whether that's in the classroom of you're exhibiting leadership because you are helping your peers, you were helping other people grow, you were helping execute tasks, things that we would associate with a leader. So it might be just a little bit of a redefinition in the way that they've interpreted what leading might look like and what they're actually doing, because I would venture to say some of the incredible things that we witness them do, a lot of us would quantify as leadership. Building businesses for a common good cause is definitely leadership. Focusing on improving initiatives is something that we would definitely identify as leadership, but they might not necessarily. So it might be just more of a conversation of how do we define leader, how do we define what leadership is.